It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting if you go to my website, emailrevealer.com, or if you just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Really excited about our guest today. Roger Rapoport has written a brand new book about Patty Hearst. He actually lived right around the corner from these folks, and he was a radical young reporter at the time. So he's lived his whole life with this story. The book is called Searching for Patty Hearst, a True Crime Novel by Roger D. Rapoport. And you can find more information at pattyhearst.com. Mr. Rapoport, are you there?
Yes, it's great to be here with you. Thanks, Ed.
No, thank you so much, man. The book's not even, the ink's not dry yet. But before we get to the book, Searching for Patty Hearst, a true crime novel, tell us about yourself. Who is Roger Rapoport?
Well, I'm a journalist who covered the Patty Hearst case, and I worked for newspapers and magazines. And I had written a book with Patty Hearst's fiancée, who was badly beaten during the kidnapping, which took place 50 years ago in February. And through mutual friends, I wrote a very flattering piece about Steve and his attempt to try to track down Patty and rescue her. And that collaboration began very shortly after Patty announced that she was dumping Steve, that she was going to run with her kidnappers, joining the Sudanese Liberation Army, and had fallen in love with one of the kidnappers, a guy named Willie Wolf. So Steve was in a pretty dark spot at that time, and he moved into my house. We wrote a book for a major New York publisher, and then that project, after I was done with almost the entire book, Steve announced that he'd been taking my chapters and rewriting them and decided he was going to publish his own book. So here I am 50 years later with a new book, a novel, that attempts to make this unbelievable story believable. Obviously, as an experienced investigator yourself, you know you don't never take one person's word for it. So in this book, we're trying to give all the participants equal time.
Okay, great. So you wrote this was basically you were co-writing a book with Steve Weed,
right?
The boyfriend. That's fascinating, and he lived with you.
That's right. And Steve is an interesting guy. He was a philosophy doctoral student teaching at the University of California, and Patty was an art student at the time. They had met when he was a math teacher at her high school, Crystal Springs, in Hillsborough, where she lived. And they fell in love when she was a junior, 16 years old. And their love affair began, and then she went on to Menlo College, and then eventually they moved in together and were going to Berkeley. And we're just a few months away from a big wedding when the kidnapping happened.
And he's alive today, or he's passed away?
Absolutely. No, he's alive.
He's alive today. Well, Patty, we know, is alive, yeah. Okay, fascinating stuff. Okay, so how did you first get involved in this whole thing?
Well, I began by covering it for New Times Magazine, and then after all this happened, and Patty was convicted for bank robbery and so on, I continued to follow the case as a journalist. And after her kidnapper, Bill Harris, was paroled from prison years later, I was the first journalist to actually interview him. And of course, he told me his side of the story. And Bill is still very much alive, as is his wife, Emily. So the three of them are the three survivors. The other six members of the kidnapping group, including Willie Wolf, the man she said she fell in love with, died in a firefight at the LAPD. So I covered the trial. I interviewed the kidnapper. I have a relative. She was also arrested for kidnapping herself in Los Angeles. And that trial where she was convicted, the judge was a relative of mine, Mark Brandler. And then I also interviewed Dr. Tom Noguchi, who's the famous celebrity Los Angeles coroner who autopsied Marilyn Monroe and Bobby Kennedy. Yeah. And he did the autopsies of the 6 Sudanese Liberation Army members who died in Los Angeles in a firefight with the LAPD. And I interviewed him at great length some years later. So there is a lot in the book that's based on the true story, but basically all the information in the book fiction. It's a novelistic treatment in it, and as we've been discussing, as journalists and reporters and investigators, we always cross-check. That's our job, is to give everybody equal time so we get all points of view, so that even when two people are in the same room at the same time, which is certainly true in this case, they can come out with completely different versions of what happened.
Oh, that is so true. Yeah.
Yeah, and you of all people would, experienced interviewers done other interviews on this subject with fascinating authors, you would appreciate that. So the more people you talk to, the more you learn. And then, of course, the point of this novel is that everybody gets their opportunity to tell what they think happened.
You said Bill Harris and Emily Harris have their own story, their own version. What's their version?
Well, you understand that much of what is being published today on this case is coming from Bill Harris, because he is the only kidnapper who's spoken out publicly. And I'm in that group. I did a very long interview with him, and he's in complete dispute, as is someone who's no longer with us, Jack Scott, who is a sports journalist who he and his wife traveled across the country with Patty and hit her in the Poconos after the SLA shootout. And, Jack has a different version of what happened. He actually sued Patty after her book came out. But Bill's version of the story was that essentially they conducted themselves within the Geneva Accords. Of course, Patty has a completely different version. And it's important that anybody who follows this story understands that Bill, because he's still alive and talking, has had many opportunities to present, his version of what really happened, because he was in the room when a lot of these things were going on. So, for example, there's a big debate about, was Patty really in love with Willie Wolfe, one of the kidnappers, or was she somehow forced to write these statements to the media that the Hearst newspapers had to publish? Who are you going to believe? And that's really where my book weighs in. We talk a lot about this whole issue of, how memory is encoded under stressful situations. Obviously, that has a big impact. I know that's something that you as an investigator know a lot about. When people are under stress, or, somebody's pointing a gun at them, it's one thing. So, for example, when Patty raised a shotgun she'd never fired before to defend Bill Harris, the guy who actually kidnapped her, because he was being tackled for shoplifting in Inglewood. That's something we can verify, because there were witnesses there who saw her firing the gun, right? But when they're locked up in a safe house in Daly City, and she's saying she was being assaulted and all that, and Bill's saying no, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, and memory, especially when you're talking about things like being in love, and there's so many fine lines and gray areas and that type of a situation. What about these stories you hear? And I believe even F. Lee Bailey's investigator at one time came out with this story, about her relationship with DeFreeze while he was in prison, some kind of a educational program she was involved in. Any of that?
Right. So it's been alleged that she was part of a group of students at Cal, and some of the SLA members were part of that group. Emily Harris was one of them. Willie Wolfe was one. And they had a kind of a prison project. It's even been reported that Emily was having an affair with one of the prisoners that she was supporting, and so on. And Patty has been in very strong denial that she ever was involved in this group of prisoners, or that she met Willie Wolfe and knew him before the kidnapping happened, or that Willie Wolfe, because he knew her, had somehow identified her, and he thought it would be a great idea to kidnap her. That's where the suggestion came from. She completely denies that. My own opinion on this, is in a small place like Berkeley, where I was living in that area at the time of the kidnapping, anything is possible, because obviously, even though she wasn't directly involved in leftist politics, and we don't know that she was actually visiting the prison, it's highly likely that somebody she knew somebody, that in this small universe, there was certainly some of these people had some contact. Probably the most interesting fact in this entire discussion is, what did they know about the SLA before the kidnapping? So their apartment had been robbed some weeks before the kidnapping. And but the weird thing is, it was a break-in, but it wasn't actually really a robbery. They didn't take anything.
Yeah.
They just came in and kind of cased the joint. So the question is, how did they get in? And why didn't they take anything? And did they actually, any of them, know Steve or Patty? And were they just doing surveillance to try to figure out how the kidnapping was going to work? Now, that we happen to know is true. We know there was a burglary. But beyond that, it gets a little sketchy. But it's a fascinating, the whole prison project is a fascinating part of this story. And I want to add this very key point. Whether or not it's true that Patty actually knew these people or had been involved with them, it is interesting how quickly she converted.
Yeah.
I mean, when you think about the timeline and how fast it happened and what a great shot she was and how she saved Bill Harris's life and so on, and what a good job she did on the bank robbery and how effective she was in that kidnapping. They carjacked right after the shootout that killed all those 6 SLA members. They carjacked a 17-year-old high school student, and she became his new best friend. He even interviewed in the LA Times talking about how nice Patty was to her, and it was the greatest night of his life running with the SLA. So clearly she was doing a fantastic job, as one of them. And boy, that was a really quick process for her. That's totally interesting. Now, in my novel, I talk about this at some length, because if you buy the idea that she quickly converted, whether or not she knew any of these people beforehand, it's interesting how effective she was. And it's also interesting that by chance that she wasn't one of the people that got shot in that shootout with the LAPD. I mean, she clearly had a gift, I guess you could say, for this. She and the Harrises were the 3 survivors, who weren't there at the time of the shootout. So
yeah, that's true. When you think about that, that does take a bit of training and skill to extricate yourself from a situation like that.
Yeah, I mean, she was firing a shotgun, a rifle, a semi-automatic, when Bill was being tackled for shoplifting in the store, and there were cops in training there and security guards, and they all ran, and as fast as they could. She was a very good shot. So either she really knew what she was doing before she was kidnapped, or boy, she was a quick study. That's pretty impressive.
Steve Weed, what is his take on this theory of her being involved with this program at the prison?
Well, we talked about that at some length because he was living with me at the time. And he was very, very involved in talking to the left, as was Patty's father, Randy Hearst, who actually went out of his way to talk to a lot of people on the left. And then Steve, after he recovered from his beating in Berkeley, moved into the Hearst home where the FBI was actually staying at the house. So Steve was very, very involved in all this conversation. I don't think he believed that Patty knew any of these people, but there's a lot of speculation about him, whether he knew any of them. That has come up repeatedly. The FBI, for example, grilled him, at great length to see if he actually knew any of the kidnappers. The answer to that question is that he didn't buy it. He didn't believe, this particular theory, but he was, frankly, as many of us were, perplexed by how articulate her communiques were, which, by the way, they forced the Hearst papers to publish as kind of a precondition for negotiation for freeing her. And they did offer to release her numerous times. In fact, for much of the time she was gone, she wasn't even living with the SLA. I mean, they weren't. 6 of them were gone. She was living with the Harrises, but she could have walked away at any point. And then by the time she got back to California from Pennsylvania, she wasn't even, in San Francisco, she wasn't even living with the kidnappers. She could have walked away at any point she wanted to.
Hey, what do you know about a place or organization called the Wells Springs Commune?
Well, I've heard of them.
Yeah.
But I'm not deeply familiar with their work. I just know them.
And their connection to all of this, that they were hiding out there. Do you know anything about that?
No, that's something that's come up, but I'm not an expert on that subject.
Okay, just curious.
I mean, remember that I'm writing a novel, so part of my mission on this project, particularly for younger people who don't remember the case, is to try to explain to them that all these theories, the ones we're talking about right now, there's a tremendous amount of conjecture because we don't have most of the people who were available at the time. Obviously the kidnapping group, et cetera, is gone. So obviously it's all kind of secondhand at this point, except for the Harrises. And even there, you're getting one side of the story.
You know what? Now that you mention it, we didn't explain any of this. We didn't explain, who the Hearsts are, who Patty Hearst was, what this kidnapping was about. We didn't explain any of that to the audience. Do you want to give us a quick synopsis of that right now?
Sure. So on the pattyhearst.com website, which my publisher James Sparling has created, we do give a really nice overview for somebody who's not familiar. So basically, the Hearst family was the original media dynasty in America, a very conservative dynasty, and Patty's grandfather ruled it from San Simeon, the Hearst Castle, which most people have heard of. And in that process, he had not just a newspaper or a radio network, and then eventually the company built a television network after, that began right around the time he died. But he's probably best known for the movie Citizen Kane, which basically talks about his political ambitions and his long affair with Marion Davies, an actress. So he lived with a mistress for 30-plus years. His son, Randy, who is Patty's father, is one of 5 children. And Randy, at the time of the kidnapping, was a publisher in San Francisco. And this family continues to be one of the major media dynasties in America. Patty herself had gone to a string of private schools before she met Steve when she was 16. And up until the time that she was kidnapped, she was an art major, and a fiancée, a bride-to-be in 1974. But what's interesting about this family, and I think it's really important, is that, I've written for the Hearst newspapers, the Chronicle in San Francisco, where I was a reporter, and I've worked for Cosmopolitan magazine, which they also own. The influence of the Hearst family is, just to give you a small example, Jeffrey Tubin wrote a book called American Heiress, and after it was published, Fox was announced that they had bought the screen rights for a drama, and within hours, Patty put out a press release, and Fox dropped the project. That's just a small example of how powerful this media empire is.
Yeah.
And they continue to have a lot of influence, although clearly there are other empires they now compete with. But at the time, there was no one that could possibly touch the Hearst empire. And I just want to give you a small example of what the Hearst newspapers are possible. There's been a lot of writing about all the coverage, and we're part of it, of what happens when a young white woman disappears, Natalie Holloway and so on. These stories just get endless coverage. But all of this kind of dates back to the Hearst, was the first person who figured this out. And he, at one point, and this goes back to 1897, he had one of his reporters free the niece of a Cuban revolutionary leader locked up in Havana prisoner. Not only did he break her out of jail and smuggle her back to the United States, but then Hearst sold the story to readers. Of course, it was a circulation bonanza. So the Maiden in Peril narrative goes back a long way. But Ed, what's really important about this story is that this is the first time one of these victims joined her kidnappers, successfully robbed a bank. They pleaded in the case, Effie Bailey, who at this point reportedly had never lost a big case. It was her attorney, probably the leading criminal attorney in America. He tried what became known as the Stockholm Syndrome defense, claiming, of course, that she had been, that the kidnappers had basically bamboozled her into all of this, and that failed twice, and she was convicted twice, first for bank robbery and second for kidnapping, and then went to jail for 22 months. Her sentence, 28 months, and then her sentence was commuted by Gerald Ford, and then she was actually pardoned by Bill Clinton.
Oh, wasn't Jimmy Carter involved?
I'll double check.
Yeah, okay. No, you're right. It would have to be Ford because it was Carter came way later. Yeah, it would have to be Ford.
Yeah, right. It was Ford. Yeah. So
it
it was Ford first, and then I believe it was Bill Clinton that did the final pardon. And what's interesting about Patty, I actually have a lot of respect for Patty and for Steve, as a matter of fact. And the reason I'm saying this, and this may surprise you, is I think both of them, since the kidnapping, have conducted themselves admirably. They both, I think, in separate ways, have gone back, to private life. They haven't really tried to exploit this, or get involved in what we're talking about right now. And I kind of admire Patty for that. That she's basically moved on. Interestingly, she has a daughter who played a key role in a Charles Manson film. She played the role of Abigail Folger, another heiress who was a victim in the Manson murders. So that's kind of an interesting twist.
What has Steve Weed gone on to do today? What does he do for a living today? How does he make a living?
Well, he's a realtor. And he's done some interviews. He's told his story, but I have to say, in both cases, they've really refrained from getting overly involved in this, which I think is pretty admirable. That they're not trying to exploit it in any way.
And Patty Hearst went on to marry her bodyguard, who I believe is former Secret Service.
That is correct, Bernard Shaw. Yes, his name is Shaw, and he died a few years back.
Really?
Yeah.
And he was former Secret Service, U.S. Secret Service.
I'm not sure. Okay. That's a good question. Yeah, you would know more about that.
No, it's just my memory. My memory is not what it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, right.
Okay, now what about, how does she make a living today, if she has to?
Well, I'm not sure what she's doing to make a living. I know that she's part of the Hearst Corporation, the Hearst family, but I'm not sure. She's done some writing. She published a novel. She's done some acting. But she doesn't have a big public presence. She's done various things.
Now, you had mentioned earlier that Jeffrey Toobin came out with this book, and then it was kind of capture kill kind of deal, right?
Right.
In your experience, dealing with so many of these people, intimately dealing with these people involved, have you noticed a pattern that perhaps there's some kind of financial motivations to keep people quiet, to portray a certain story, NDAs perhaps?
Well, that's a really good question. I'm really glad you brought that up. So I will tell you that Steve was persona non grata with Patty's parents. They were very unhappy with his efforts and his public appearances and so forth. And I'm not aware that there were any NDAs for him or anybody else who was connected with it. I don't think it ever got to that point. However, there is something that we haven't talked about, something that really got Patty upset. After she was kidnapped, Governor Reagan, who Patty despised because, he was totally against any kind of ransom attempt, as was the Attorney General. Patty got very, very angry when Reagan reappointed his mother to the Board of Regents for 16 years at the UC Board of Regents. That was a real tipping point for Patty, and she really got furious about that,
But did you discover or come across any signs of people like they want to talk to you, but they have to go talk to somebody else first and come back? I have to get an okay and come back to you, that kind of thing?
Well, as a matter of fact, that's a pretty timely question. I got an email just before, like about 10 minutes before we began this interview, and let me read you. See if I can find this here.
Exclusive stuff. This is great.
I'll see if I can find it here. Hold on a minute.
Good thing we booked this for 1 o'clock and not 12. Okay.
The long story short is that I got a note from someone who works at San Simeon. And even though the Hearst don't own it anymore, and they're not part of it, they still have influence over what happens at San Simeon, and it's not an NDA, but they've made it very clear that in the past, when they have put Patty Hearst books in the gift shop at San Simeon, and you can imagine that would be pretty interesting, certainly more interesting than the architect story, that the families literally had meltdowns in the gift shop over this. So as a result, Patty Hearst books don't make it into San Simeon.
That's interesting.
Yeah, literally, I just got this note, and it was sort of like it's kind of like the when Fox announced in the morning that they were going to buy Tubman's book and make a feature film out of it. Patty put out a press release. It was in Variety at 1 o'clock, and at 3 o'clock, or a couple hours later, Fox announced they were canceling the project. It didn't even make it to dinner. That's a pretty effective.
No, those
you talk about NDAs. I mean,
those fixers, man. Clout. Yeah, they're on top of it. They don't sleep. They're up all 24 hours a day, man. They got that going, man. And they live on that stuff, man. Now, what about you hear these theories about the SLA? Like, well, it's such a suspicious group. It starts out of a prison, a psychiatric prison, and intelligence background, intelligent COINTELPRO type influence or manipulation of this group. What did you make of that?
Well, that's a really, really good question. My opinion is that the SLA never really functioned as anything other than essentially an attempt to create a revolution that never happened. They were so ineffective, and there was so much debate within them that I don't think they ever really functioned in any way other than the killing of the Oakland school superintendent, which everybody it was their first time that the public had ever heard of them. So they assassinated the Oakland school superintendent, and then they kidnapped Patty Hearst. And those are the only two things they ever did. The leader, Donald DeFreeze in Q, was just completely ineffective. He just made mistake after mistake. And Patty fought him on a lot of this, according to Bill Harris. And, of course, in her own book, she has another way of looking at it. But they just couldn't get anywhere. The negotiation with the Hearst over the money, they were far more interested in the publicity that they were getting by forcing the Hearst empire to publish front-page communiques, kind of flipping the script on this missing white woman story that the Hearst empire had pioneered. And but I think they were, in terms of achieving anything, they were probably go down as one of the least effective revolutionary groups in history.
Right, which makes them even more sus. You know what I mean? Like, if I were FBI or COINTELPRO, I'd want a bunch of buffoons running around in the gang that couldn't shoot this straight.
Right, and the FBI had a terrible time. They had a huge part of the FBI was on this case, and it was just a disaster in terms of them trying to make contacts. And part of it was that they weren't part of the old left or the new left. Their traditional sources just simply were not able to connect with them. So they were kind of a rogue group from the very beginning. I think it's fair to say that the one thing that they agreed on was that Patty was their trophy, and they guessed right on her. But I think that was an accident. They may have known something about her and Steve. Steve, neither of them were directly involved in the left. Whether any of them knew any of the kidnappers prior to that in Berkeley, which is a relatively small community, the student community, is hard to say. But I'd say this about the SLA: except for kidnapping Patty and converting her and turning her into a bank robber and a quasi-revolutionary, it's hard to think of anything they got right.
Well, except that they sort of kind of founded Kwanzaa, with the seven heads of the SLA are the same 7 feasts of Kwanzaa. How that happens, that's for another book one day, right? Roger Rapoport, we're talking about, and Roger D. Rapoport, and the book is Searching for Patty Hearst, a true crime novel. The website is pattyhearst.com, where you can get into all the weeds of this whole story. Now you get into, I saw the publicity package that was sent out about the ransom money, how Hearst claimed he didn't have the money.
Well, he went out of his way to explain that he was, living on a fixed income, and at his house in Tahoe and all the houses they had and the airplanes they flew and all that stuff, that was all, the corporation owned everything, so they didn't have title to anything. They owned a big house in Hillsborough, but, he didn't have the ability to go to the bank and borrow money to ransom, and eventually he got the company to agree to a conditional deal where they would put up some of the money that the SLA wanted. But the reality is that, as a chief executive, the idea that he couldn't come up with $4 million, at the beginning, really defeated. It was self-defeating because the SLA had all kinds of evidence of the assets of the company, and even though he claimed that the will from his dad tied up that money, in other words, it was under the control of the board. There's no question that the real reason that they didn't put up the money is that the FBI, the Attorney General, and Governor Reagan, and the hostage consultants felt that they should get into a negotiation. And that negotiation was a tremendous asset for the SLA because then they had the free food giveaway and they were able to go on with converting Patty, showing her the assets of the corporation that her dad, was a top executive of, and so on. So that argument didn't hold up. But there's something else here that's really important about the Hearst family and their failure to negotiate. They were consulting with everybody. They had swamis, psychics. They had the FBI, all these other experts in the house. So it was kind of a free-for-all. And in the book, I talk about this. In the novel, I talk about this at some length. So instead of just finding the money somewhere, they got into a negotiation that just collapsed, and that was very, very, very poorly thought out.
Now, part of this food giveaway, that also kind of turned into a fiasco, right? Where there was, I recall as a kid, and I was young, I was in 8th grade, but I recall the payoff, where there was like a chaos at one of the food giveaways where people overcame the truck and just distributed food themselves, throwing it in the street.
Yeah, right. And this was, once again, the management of the food giveaway became very problematic. Now, you can't blame the Hearst for that, but it did kind of exemplify the chaos that ensued when they didn't quickly just do the ransom, the $4 million, the original negotiation just collapsed. And again, they were under a lot of pressure, from the Attorney General and so on, to not do this. And from a corporate point of view, it was a total disaster, and I think that kind of fed into the food giveaway, which was a good faith effort, but it just literally just evolved.
Now, and see, it's one of these things in my life where I remember this. I remember seeing it on TV, but when I go back and try and look this up and find film of it or anybody discussing it before today, I come up empty-handed. Now, did this happen? This food giveaway, was it just in California? Was it in the Bronx too?
No, I think it was primarily in the Oakland area.
Okay.
It was mostly in California, yeah. And here's something that I think younger people might be interested in. Your daughter gets kidnapped. You get a ransom request. Why don't you just go ahead and get the money instead of saying, well, we're open to donations for the free food program? That is just the sort of thing that just pushed away any opportunity early on to release Patty. And, of course, as you saw in the shootout, the risks of not ransoming her right away were very substantial. Fortunately, she wasn't at that location in L.A. when it happened, but I don't think that was well thought out by the family. And I know that contributed to the divorce between Patty's parents, which happened after all this was over, after the trial and so on.
And also, do you describe that Steve Weed and Patty Hearst's father came up with their own scheme to rescue her? What is that story?
Right. So they had Steve was constantly negotiating with his own idea, trying to figure out with her dad if there was a separate way that they could do it. And of course that went absolutely nowhere because their contacts that they were cultivating didn't have any access to her, so that simply didn't go anywhere.
And what was the situation with Noguchi? Noguchi, you interviewed him, but there were some complaints about him too as well?
Well, Noguchi was an extremely controversial coroner, and there was a lot of political opposition to him that finally led to his departure from the department. But many of his cases were controversial. But he pioneered an idea called the psychological autopsy, where you go into the life history of the deceased and try to figure out, what might have led to this. So it wasn't just a straight medical exam. It became a psychiatric analysis of the history of the person who died. And of course, that did not go over very well, obviously, with the families and so on. They weren't really interested in him, trying to do a lot of interviewing to figure out why somebody was in the wrong place at the wrong time, that kind of thing. But everything he touched was controversial. The Kennedy autopsy, he did the Manson autopsies and so forth. Obviously, many people debate, these cases. Marilyn Monroe is a good example. There's still a lot of controversy over her death. Was it really accidental? So, L.A. is kind of a key point for these kinds of controversies, and Noguchi ended up in the middle of a lot of them.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. Now, we were talking before the show, and I says, hey, what do you want the audience, if there's one thing you want the audience to know, what question you want me to ask you? And he says, who can we believe? Who can we believe?
Well, in the novel, that question comes up directly, and the answer is that you can't ever take one person's word for it. Even when two people are in the same room at the same time, they might have different versions of events, and that's because when there's a lot of stress around an event like this one, people's memory is not necessarily 100% reliable. And as an investigator, I'm sure you've found not just two people disagreeing, but even evidence that undercuts what somebody's saying. And it isn't that people are necessarily evil. Their memories are just not necessarily reliable. And here's an example. So when Randy Hearst says, I don't have $4 million to ransom my daughter and I'm part of $1 billion company, do you think anybody's going to take him seriously? And this leads to the kind of skepticism that's at the heart of my book, which is, how can you believe somebody who's part of $1 billion company, living in a mansion and flying off in private planes, during all this is going on, to go to Mexico with Desi Arnaz and so forth? How can you believe that he doesn't have access to $4 million? Now, in Patty's case, it's a lot more problematic because obviously she was the victim, so there's a lot of sympathy for her. But when she became a revolutionary, a lot of that sympathy for this missing woman just disappeared, including people who'd send money to try to support the food project. So I think, in essence, the heart of this story is, trying to make a unbelievable story believable is, you have to look at all points of view, listen to every vantage point, and then make up your own mind. So, for example, if you're researching something, as you do as an investigator, you would never take on a case, right, and go talk to one person and then go back to your client and say, okay, here's what's happened, right? You'd go out and talk to a lot of people, correct?
Unless they stop paying, right? They run out of money.
Yeah. Right. But in the current world that we live in, all too often, one person's account of something is definitive, and I think that's been damaging to our country. Now,
you said that Patty Hearst's father was hanging out with Desi Arnaz. Ricky Ricardo?
Yes.
Fascinating.
They took a break and went down to Mexico.
During the kidnapping?
Well, after this thing had happened, and there'd been when she decided to join and so forth. At one point, they decided to take a brief holiday, and they went down to Mexico and stayed with Desi Arnaz. And they needed a break. I mean, they were under a lot of pressure. Of course, you can imagine what happened when they found out that 6 of the SLA members had died in a shootout, and they didn't know if Patty was one of those 6 victims. They had to do the autopsies of the charred remains. So that was there were some terrible moments. The other thing was the media was basically camped in their front yard, so there was a real circus going on out in front of the house. That was, a pretty awful moment to suddenly be under the microscope for a media.
Yeah. I tell you, that Desi Arnaz, though, man, what a fascinating guy, man. The real story of that guy really has not come out.
Yeah.
And that whole family, that guy was involved. Al Capone, that guy was involved with everything. you know, Frank Sinatra, this guy was out there, man. And I remember that day too, that picture came out when you said about how when it came out that she was actually, with the SLA rather than a victim. She had that holding that machine gun in the bank, front page.
Right.
Whatever, and it turned flipped like a switch. The whole.
And it wasn't just a bank. It was a bank owned by the father of one of her close friends from high school.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she told me. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Maybe she knew her way around. Okay. Now, what about what do you think was bigger, the actual kidnapping and that whole story, or the trial?
Well, the trial is absolutely fascinating. It was F. Lee Bailey, just completely blew the case in the minds of the family and a lot of legal observers. But you have to think about what the jury was witnessing, which was, they claim this sort of Stockholm Syndrome defense. But the problem was that she didn't just rob a bank. She went on to actually participate in a kidnapping later in Los Angeles. So that did not bode very well for her defense. And all the communications and so forth, and then the physical evidence that she'd been there. So that was a very, very bad moment for the family, you can imagine. And they got absolutely nowhere. She lost both cases. So clearly her actions, defeated that entire defense.
Now that kidnapping, it was more of a carjacking, I guess, right? And it was portrayed in the film about these two kids. They were all, they big joyride, right? What do you make of all that? Did you ever talk to those victims of the kidnapping?
No, but Tom Matthews has been very extensively interviewed.
Okay.
And his account of it was they couldn't have been nicer. They even released him so that he could make a state baseball championship. He was on the baseball team in his high school. So they couldn't have been nicer to him. And that story, indicates, I think, the fact that they were not afraid that he was going to go back and turn them in. They basically released him, although is not his dad's car that they had carjacked.
Out of all the films out there and the books and stuff like that, what's the biggest misconception from your personal experience that you can tell me, hey, Ed, I know this part is wrong?
Well, I think that the toughest part of this story for everybody is the idea that Patty Hearst was somehow trapped into this situation. It's a very tough argument to make that she became a victim. That was the legal defense that failed twice. But I think the best way to look at it is that, yes, she did join with them. That's indisputable. But the reason that she joined with them is that she felt she had no choice at that point. She was literally running for her life. And she didn't feel that turning herself in was necessarily going to go very well. And particularly after 6 of the SLA members got killed by the LAPD, I think it was extremely difficult for her to feel safe turning herself in. And that's pretty indisputable from my point of view, that it was a matter of trying to stay safe. That's why she went into hiding. And I think if she hadn't been captured in San Francisco in the fall of 1975, I think it's conceivable she could have been like DJ Cooper. She could have just disappeared.
DB Cooper.
DB Cooper. Yeah.
And that shootout was live on TV. That's another thing I can remember. That thing was live on TV, and then they burned that building down to the ground.
So she was a little nervous about turning herself in because she wasn't sure, how it would be handled, because the LAPD was the biggest firefight in LAPD history, more than 4,000 rounds. So I think she just didn't feel this was the time to show up at a police station.
Yeah. Now,
particularly because she'd been involved in armed robbery and so forth.
Oh, yeah, she's going to have some problems, yeah. But now, we talked earlier about the intelligence manipulation of the SLA. And all the people you've spoke to, have any of them tried to convince you, hey, Roger Rapoport, that whole thing was a setup, man, was a psyop, the whole thing? Anybody try to tell you that?
Well, when I was working with Steve, this whole theory came up, and he spent a lot of time on his own talking to the leftist community, as did Randy. And, and together they went out and talked to the left at great length. And it's interesting that neither of them ever moved on this point of view, because they obviously had journalistic contacts and so on, and Steve was talking to a lot of reporters. My impression is that they didn't believe it. They didn't think it was true. Does that just mean that they weren't talking to the right people? Was there somebody in prison who knew more than they did? Obviously, there's some very advanced theories on this idea, and clearly there were a lot of connections between the Berkeley left community in this prison project and the SLA. So I think it's just a really good open question. Hopefully, at some point, someday, somebody will come up with documents that really can answer this question one way or another. But I don't think the FBI was ever able to figure it out. Obviously their connections weren't able to prove it.
And you said that Steve and Randy had concocted their own plan to rescue her. What was that?
Oh, they were trying. They had all kinds of ideas, to try to, break in and find her and so on and so forth with their own team. But they couldn't find her. So, any possible scenario that they were kicking around just went absolutely nowhere because there was no way to do it. It just they could never make it happen because they didn't know where she was. So there wasn't any, the sources that they were trying to tap just weren't around.
Interesting. So they had their own mercenary type guys that kick in doors, but I guess they would also too have their own intelligence sources and former intelligence people, being in the newspaper empire, the way that was.
I don't think there's any question that if Randy knew where she was, that he might have potentially made a move on his own, because the FBI was basically in the house the whole time, and that was not going very well. They were getting absolutely nowhere. So he was thinking about, is there any other private source that we can go to, But the problem was nobody could pinpoint where she was, even though she was kind of hiding in plain sight, more or less. I mean, she was just living in the Bay Area. It wasn't like she was underground, living in Cuba or something.
Yeah, what a difference, right, from 1974 to 2024, because now they'd find them in a week, you know what I mean? Before there would be 10 news stories between the time of the kidnapping and 10
right.
recorder, and with technology and ID cards and credit cards, everything we have. They didn't have debit cards back
right.
in those days,
No, it was a completely different story.
Okay, Roger D. Rapoport. The book is, once again, it's called Searching for Patty Hearst, a true crime novel. You can find more information at pattyhearst.com. And there's an events page to it, pattyhearst.com, if you want to go meet Roger D. Rapoport in person and ask him some tough questions you don't think I asked, okay? But Roger, anything I haven't asked you that you want the audience to know about?
Yes. At the events, which are mostly in California, we're doing some in the Midwest, and we'll be doing some on the East Coast as well. I am looking forward to meeting anyone that can answer any of the questions you asked today. So if anybody in your audience has new information, let's do another show, okay?
Oh, no, 100%, definitely. That usually does happen, too.
Yeah.
Now, I would normally ask, how has the book been received? But the ink's not even dry. It's not coming out until January. How about the reviews, though?
Well, that's a good question. We've been getting quite a few reviews of the book, and they've been really, quite wonderful. We really, really appreciated it. And I have to tell you that as an author, the most exciting thing is to talk to people who are younger and don't actually remember the case. There's just so much interest on all of this. It's just fascinating. The whole Stockholm Syndrome thing, of course, is a big deal right now, and so we're very, very grateful to the early reviewers who've been very kind to the book. But I think this is a unique story. And the really good thing about Patty and Steve is they have not tried to go out, over the years and say, they both did books at the time, but since then they haven't gotten into a big battle about, well, I was there, I knew, that kind of thing. They've stepped back from that, and that's pretty rare in the world. world that we're in,
Have you had a chance to talk to Patty about this?
I wish I did. I wish I could say yes to that. Patty has not been doing interviews, but I hope she will. I hope for the anniversary that she'll want to do that. That would be very exciting.
Yeah, just think back in those days, we didn't have 24-hour news, but this was a 24-hour news story. They were breaking in all the time.
Yeah,
with those bulletins.
And the coverage was quite wonderful. What's really interesting, talking to other journalists about this fictional approach to it, is it's, as you've been indicating during our talk, there's so many unanswered questions.
Yeah.
And it's so frustrating not to be able to do it. So I've tried very hard to put the story together in a believable way. And one of the surprising things about the book is that I'm very sympathetic to Patty. Other writers have been really tough on her, and I don't think that's good. She was in an impossible situation, and you can imagine how she felt when her parents, who are part of a $1 billion company, couldn't come up with $4 million. I mean, that's got to hurt, right?
And just a kid too. She was a kid.
Yeah, a 19-year-old girl. She's living with these guys, and she's blindfolded, and she's listening to the radio, and there's her dad on the radio saying, "Well, no, I don't think I've got, I can't do this." That's kind of discouraging, and that may be the key to her behavior. When your dad says no, and that kind of money is, available easily within this organization.
Yeah.
And you have to ask yourself, what was going on within the Hearst Corporation? Why didn't they want to release this young woman? I mean, if it had been your daughter or my daughter, we're not billionaires, right? But we would have figured something out, right? I mean, no kidding.
Yeah, even Desi Arnaz probably could have came up with a couple of million, so without much effort.
And Bing Crosby and all their other friends,
Boy.
So here she is sitting in a closet, blindfolded, and she's listening to the radio, and her dad's on the radio saying, "Oh, $4 million," and he did a statement about how he doesn't have that much money, and
Yeah, so much of this story is the radio, too. Those recorded cassette tapes were played over the radio. But we're out of time. Roger D. Rapoport. The book is Searching for Patty Hearst, a true crime story. PattyHearst.com. There's an events page there to meet Roger Rapoport in person and give him your secret info. Sleep him, some little note there with your top secret tips. Hey, Roger, thank you so much, man. And we will have you come back and flesh this out some more, okay?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Take care.
Good night.
Bye.